Okay, we need to talk about Hans Niemann. So he's the boy that's becoming a man right now. He's only 18 years old. He's going to be 19 in June. So he's the same age as Ali Reza, and his rating right now is just rapidly climbing. So he just won the Capablanca Memorial in Cuba. Now that was a strong tournament, but there were quite a few 2500 odd GMs. Still great players, of course, but not into that 2600 club. But the tournament he then played in Malmo, Sweden, so he flew from Cuba to Malmo, then played on kind of jet lag at the start of the tournament, and this one, as you can see on screen here, was a much stronger field. I mean, you've got former 2700 plus players, Alexei Shirov, Mickey Adams. Now Shirov had a terrible tournament, by the way, as you can see, but really fantastic players, not quite in their prime anymore. But then you had also young rising stars such as Arjun, and that's the game I want to look at here. So to win this tournament in the way that Hans did was quite incredible, and you can see his performance rating there, 28.43, really incredible stuff. He's a rising star right now. He also played in the quarterfinals of the recent Charity Cup, one of the Meltwater Tour events, and he only got knocked out by Magnus Carlsen there in the quarters. So let's have a look at his chess. He kicked off here with d4 against Arjun. We had d5, pawn c4, pawn c6, the Slav defense, and now knight f3, knight f6, and the most common move here is knight c3, but we had pawn e3 instead, still a very common idea. So you block in this bishop, but white will develop that in the later middle game. Often white's going e4 at some point, or black striking at the centre, and then that bishop comes to life. So bishop f5, the standard Slav developing move, knight c3, pawn e6, and now white goes knight to h4, looking to pick up the bishop pair. You do lose some time when you play like this, but okay, you get that long-term advantage. Now black often flicks in this bishop e4 move. You don't want to be taking this one. After the pawn recaptures, then the knight can't retreat, g5 is threatened, you have to start going g3. It's just not a good pawn structure. So white goes f3 here, the standard response. You kick the bishop back, and now there's no need to immediately take it. First queen b3 was played, pressuring this pawn, queen c7 defended, and now white doesn't develop this bishop, instead bishop d2 was played. And already here Niemann signalling his intentions to play aggressively. He wants to castle queenside. So we had bishop to e7 now. This does x-ray that unprotected knight on h4. And in this same tournament, Niemann played pawn to g3 against Alexei Shirov, won another nice game there where he castled queenside. So he's done his homework, he knows his prep. But in this game, he took on g6 instead. So the pawn recaptured. Now we had castles queenside, and instantly you might be wondering, well, okay, isn't white just dropping this pawn? Now it doesn't work here for tactical reasons. Then white takes on b7 at the end of the line. So instead Arjun took on c4, the queen recaptured, and now again he doesn't capture this pawn. This time if you do it, it's bad because of knight b5. You hit the queen, you can't take, or then the white queen takes your queen. And if you go queen to g3, the only way to hold the rook, then you're running into bishop e1, the whole thing's busted. So still you can't take that pawn. Instead a6 was played, preparing c5 without any knight b5 stuff, and now simply king to b1. And again, you don't want to be taking this pawn. This time it's for initiative reasons. You're dragging your queen all the way offside of the board. A simple move like queen b3, hitting the pawn could come. Yes, you can come back and defend, but then bishop d3, let's say the knight develops, rook h1, castles, knight e2. The whole point of this knight e2, by the way, is that if c5 comes now, well, then we can come back to the c file. It's just a very uncomfortable position for black. It's hard to get in any pawn breaks. You're going to suffer for the rest of the game. e4 is coming, white's got the bishop pair. So this is why that pawn wasn't snaffled on h2. Instead, Arjun just wants to develop his pieces, not go pawn grabbing. So after king b1 in this position here, he played knight b to d7. And again, white's under no obligation to push the h-pawn. You could go e4 here or even g4. Instead, h4 was played, taking some space. Now it can't be taken in some of the lines. And here's an interesting moment. So you want to castle the king, but if you go kingside, well then you're running into a big and easy attack with pawn g4. If you go queenside, well again there's some problems here. White can go things like knight to a4, rook to c1. It just becomes very difficult to actually get c5 in, especially when the white king's already gone to b1, your king's still on c8, and if you ever try and sidestep to b8, well then queen b3 can come, the bishop's looking at this pawn using the pin. So it's some deep stuff here, but castling queenside doesn't really solve all the black problems. So Arjun played the best move in the position. He pushed with c5. Normally not so great when you haven't castled to start opening the position, but here it's justified because if you don't do it now, it's very difficult to achieve it in future. Now we didn't have a captures there. You don't want to bring the knight in, start flooding in the black pieces. So instead the queen shuffled away, it came to b3. We had a captures here, the pawn recaptured, and although white now has this isolated queen's pawn, it takes away those key squares of c5 and e5, especially c5, also opens up this bishop in future. So queen b6 played, challenging the white queen, good move. Here we had queen a4, keeping those ones on, and now Arjun missteps. It is a tricky position because your king's in the centre like said, but best here was simply rook to c8, coming to the file, accepting you're not going to be castling there any time soon or in the future, and then say white goes g4, carrying on, well you can go bishop b4, just trying to initiate exchanges basically. But rook c8 wasn't played, instead queen c6 came, and this shows where Arjun's still building his understanding. You know, this is really a bad move because white can just capture and leave black with a terrible suffering pawn structure. Now first this move was played, it's not the most precise, taking was best first, the queen dropped back, the bishop came back, and here Arjun should recognise the mistake, not put the queen back there, play something like b5 or another move. But here he goes back to queen c6, now we did have the capture, pawn recaptures, and this is really just a miserable pawn structure for black, this is the problem. So now you can start with g3 here to hold this pawn, but knight a4 was selected, still a good move, bringing the rook to the c file. Now we had knight d5, so it does open up an attack here, and Hans actually ignored it. He went rook c1, targeting this pawn. Now best for Arjun would have actually been picking up here, according to the engines here. I mean, I can see why he didn't do this, because after you capture, bishop takes, rook takes on c6, there is bishop f2, and here you could pick up the d pawn, let's say, in exchange for the a pawn, but then white's going to have these two connected passes on the queen side. Looks like it should be lost long term, or you have to be very precise. So I can see why Arjun didn't do this. He selected to try and hold on to these pawns, and that's what his play is centered around now, but it's quite passive. So he goes bishop b4. We had an exchange here. The knight recaptured, and now if you bring the bishop to e4, which looks very aggressive, it's possible, but then you could be running into f5 in future, then you have to retreat and lose your bishop pair. So bishop e2 was selected instead, and now this knight came to b8, looks pretty miserable holding those pawns, but okay, Arjun wants to wiggle out the rook with rook a7, and at least you're not losing material. So pawn g3 now played, king e7 opens this rook to join the game. The knight came to c5 here, rook a7, pawn f4, and now we can see the bishop's joining the party, it's coming to this f3 diagonal. So rook d8 was played, targeting that pawn, it was defended by this rook, pawn a5 now, so one weakness doesn't have to be babysat any longer at least. The bishop came to f3, knight d5, this rook came to e1, protecting this e3 square from knight jumps, and now this knight finally redevelops into the game, and this is quite an instructive learning moment really. Why does Hans not capture on d7? Why does he play knight d3? Well, when you're the side with the space, your opponent's cramped, you don't want to initiate exchanges of pieces, then your opponent has more space to move, you want to keep them under pressure. So very thematic idea, he just drops that knight back, the king now comes to d6, protecting this pawn which was attacked, and rook e2 now came, preparing to double on the file. It's all just so logical here, beautiful to watch, very Magnus-esque in terms of how white massages the position. So rook a6 held the pawn, this rook doubled, the other one came to c8. And now here's an interesting moment. There are different ways for white to just keep squeezing. It's a very pleasant position. Black is doomed to passivity, but pawn b3 was a nice one. So it prepares this knight maneuver of b2 to c4, checking the black king. So knight e3 now came, hits the rook, rook d2, the knight hopped back. Arjun really can't do very much. Knight b2, and now rook c7, waiting another move. The rook doubled again, knight e3 hit the rook again, it came back. They're coming up to time control here, so they're looking to not lose on time. And now here Arjun makes a mistake. So he could come back again, or his best move here was actually bringing this knight to f6. But what Arjun did was knight to f5 in the time pressure, targets 2 pawns, but an excellent move by Hans now. He just ignores the threat, goes pawn g4, says, okay, take that pawn if you want it, because now look at your knight after bishop to h1. It's completely dead, it's got no squares, and soon you'll be forced to play g5. I then win my pawn back, and in the meantime, you've just made your position so much worse. So that pawn wasn't captured, really nice calculation. Instead, the knight came back to e3, but here, of course, Arjun's just helped Hans push his kingside pawns. So the rook came to e1, hits the knight, it dropped back to d5, and now an excellent move by Hans, the best move in the position. Can you find it here if I pause? It's nothing swashbuckling, but just the best move. So pawn f5, you start breaking down those light squares, and there's actually a really beautiful unexpected mate here. So if black captures, pawn recaptures, say you take again, well, knight c4 out of nowhere is just checkmate. You can see this e-file's now been opened, cutting the king. Really nice one there. So we didn't have that captures occurring. Instead, rook to c8 was played. Knight f8 was technically best, by the way, but it's just so passive, of course. So rook c8 played. Now we had this knight hitting c4 with check, king e7, and now pawn h5. Further breaking down of this pawn structure. You can capture here, pawn takes back, just a different way to play. White can continue massaging. Now you've opened the g file. So instead we had pawn g5, trying to keep some lines closed. And now I love this with great endgame play. Okay, we've made all the progress we can kind of on that side of the board. Let's turn our attention elsewhere. King safety. Well, pawn a4 was now played. So it stops any a4 counterplay from black. You also fix that pawn as a weakness on a5, and you give your king some space to tuck itself away. So knight f4 was played. Maybe looks nice on this square, but it's just firing at thin air. It's not actually stopping the white pieces. King to a2, rook b8, king a3, and now this rook came back to d8. Very difficult to do anything. We had a captures on e6, pawn recaptures, and just look at the state of that black pawn structure. Really miserable. Rook c2 played, this one came to f8, x-rays the bishop if the knight ever moves, so the bishop came to e4, king d8, this knight came back to d2, opens up the attack on that c6 pawn, so knight f6 was played, and this one actually leaves the pawn to be taken if white wants it. Then black wants to take on g4. You could actually go in for this line, let black take there, but instead bishop f3 was played. Let's just let black sweat. And so Arjun now looks to mix it up elsewhere. He goes pawn g6 here. So this one was captured. Rook g8 now prepared to recapture that one, leave this knight on the outpost. The knight came to c4, but now it's looking to hop into that e5 square. That would be pretty brutal. So the knight hopped back to cover it, but now rook h2, swinging to the h-file, invading down there. So the rook took on g6. We had a check down here, king c7. The rook now came to h7, pinning the knight, threatening knight e5. So the king came back, and now the other one doubled on the file, joining the party. So rook f6 played, once again x-raying the bishop. This rook now came to g7, hits the pawn. The knight hopped back, covers that attack, also opens up this attack on the bishop. So it came to e4 here, and now the knight hopped all the way back to f8. Very miserable move, but it does cover the d7 one tactically. This knight now came to e5, and taking here is no good. Then the pawn recaptures, say rook f4 for example. Will we invade down here? The bishop's immune, or then you're getting mated. It's similar stuff to what we see in the game. So we didn't have takes on e5. Instead, the rook came to f4 immediately, but now rook h8, same problems here for black. If you take here, well, now you're actually getting mated like this. King e8, rook f7, and taking the knight with mate is just unavoidable. So you can't actually pick up the bishop. Now this one was taken on e5, the pawn recaptured, c5 from Arjun. There's really nothing he can do, desperately hoping for c4, open some lines. But now a beautiful interference tactic here from Hans. He goes bishop to f5, cutting the connection between rook and knight. So if you take that one, then once again this is mate in one. So after bishop f5, king e8 was played, holds that knight, but now bishop g6 check, king d8, bishop f7 once again cuts the connection. The king now came to e7, and now you can drop that bishop back to g6 or h5. Instead we had takes here, still more than good enough, and that's takes with check as well. So you can't recapture with either of these pieces. The king has to take, but now rook h6 check, and that rook on h6 is the problem. Loose pieces drop off. So the king captured here, and now the rook took on g5 with check. You don't even need to take that one straight away, and here Arjun resigned. Let's say king d4, rook takes here, completely lost, pawn down and an exchange down. So a very nice game from Hans, good prep and wonderful execution of that endgame. If you enjoyed this video and want to see another epic chess game, click here. Oh, that's my phone. Thanks for watching, see you soon.